Chapter 5, Exile in Brussels. 5. The Deutsche Brusseler. Marx found publishers both in Brussels and in Paris for his answer to Proudhon, but, although it was not very voluminous, he had to pay for the costs of the printing himself. By the time the book appeared in midsummer, 1847, he also had a mouthpiece in the Deutsche Brusseler which offered him the possibility of placing his views before the public. The paper had been issued twice a week since the beginning of the year by Adalbert von Bornstedt, who had formerly edited Bornstein's Vorwärts in Paris, and who had been in the pay of both the Austrian and Prussian governments, a fact which has since been irrefutably established from documents in the Berlin and Vienna archives. And the only point which is not quite clear is whether Bornstedt was continuing his spying in Brussels. There was a certain amount of suspicion against him, but this was dispelled by the fact that the Prussian ambassador in Brussels roundly denounced his paper to the Belgian authorities. Naturally, these denunciations may very well have been made in order to throw dust into the eyes of the revolutionary elements which had collected in Brussels, and to accredit Bornstedt in their ranks, for the defenders of throne and altar have never been squeamish in their choice of means to further their lofty aims. Marx in any case did not believe that Bornstedt was a Judas. Despite its many weaknesses, the Deutsche Brusseler was doing good work, he declared. And those who thought it not good enough should work to make it better and not shield themselves behind the facile pretext that suspicion clung to Bornstedt's name. On August 8 we find Marx writing bitterly to Howe. Either the man's no good, or it may be his wife, or it's the tendency, or the style, or the size, or the distribution involves a certain amount of danger. Our Germans have always 1,000 words of wisdom up their sleeves to prove why they should once again let an opportunity slip by, unutilized. An opportunity for doing something is nothing but a source of embarrassment for them. He then sighs that his manuscripts are suffering the same fate as the Deutsche Brusseler and ends up, with a robust curse at the fools who reproached him because he preferred to write in French rather than not write at all. Even if we assume from this that Marx treated the suspicion against Bornstedt somewhat lightly in order not to let an opportunity slip by unutilized, it would hardly be possible to reproach him for it because the opportunity was indeed favorable and it would have been foolish to let it slip by merely on account of suspicion. In the spring of 1847 pressing financial need had compelled the King of Prussia to call together the United Diet, a gathering of the former provincial diets, that is to say, a feudal body along cooperative lines similar to the one called by Louis XVI in the spring of 1789 under similar outward compulsion. Matters had certainly not developed so rapidly in Prussia as they had previously in France, but still, the United Diet kept the purse strings tightly drawn and brusquely informed the government that it would refuse to vote any moneys until its rights had been extended and in particular until a guarantee had been given that it would be convened regularly. With this things had begun to move, for the financial straits of the government were really pressing. Sooner or later the dance would have to begin anew, and the sooner the music struck up the better. This was the idea which pervaded the contributions of Marx and Engels to the Deutsche Brusseler. An article which was published anonymously, but which, to judge from style and content, came from the pen of Engels, dealt with the debates in the United Diet on free trade and protective tariffs. At the time Engels was thoroughly convinced that the German bourgeoisie needed protective tariffs in order to prevent itself being driven to the wall by foreign industry, and to give itself an opportunity of developing sufficient strength to overcome feudalism and absolutism. For this reason, and for this reason only, Engels advised the proletariat to support the agitation for protective tariffs. In his opinion, List, the authority of the protectionists, had produced the best bourgeois German economic literature, although he declared that List's best work had been copied from Ferrier, the French theorist of the continental system. He also warned the workers against being fooled by phrases about the welfare of the laboring classes which were being used by both protectionists and free traders as an ostentatious shield for their own self-serving agitation, and declared that the wages of the workers would remain the same under protectionism as under free trade. He defended protectionism purely and simply as a progressive bourgeois measure, and this was Marx's standpoint also. A longer contribution which appeared in the Deutsche Brusseler, repulsing an attack on the part of Christian feudal socialism, was the joint work of Marx and Engels. The attack had been launched in the Rheinische Beobachter, an organ which the government had recently founded in Cologne in order to play off the workers of the Rhineland against the bourgeoisie. It was in the columns of this paper that young Hermann Wagner won his spurs, as he afterwards placed on record in his memoirs. Marx and Engels maintained close connections with Cologne, and they were obviously aware of Wagner's activities, for mocking references to neat ecclesiastical commissioners formed a sort of refrain to their observations, and at the time Wagner was an ecclesiastical commissioner in Magdeburg. The Rheinische Beobachter now used the failure of the government to obtain what it wanted from the United Diet for an attempt to mislead the workers, declaring that by refusing to vote the necessary monies the bourgeoisie had shown that all it cared about was seizing power in the state in its own interests. It cared nothing for the welfare of the people, but merely pushed forward the masses in order to intimidate the government. The masses were being treated as nothing but cannon fodder in an attack on the government. Marx and Engels replied in a fashion which is obvious to us today. The proletariat had no more illusions about the bourgeoisie than it had about the government, and its only consideration was which served its purpose better, the rule of the bourgeoisie or the rule of the government. The answer to the question could be obtained by a simple comparison between the situation of the German workers and that of the English and French workers. "Happy people," declared the Rheinische Beobachter. "You have won the battle of fundamental principles, and if you don't know what that is, ask your representatives to explain it to you. And perhaps during their long speeches you will forget your hunger." These demagogic phrases were answered by Marx and Engels with caustic mockery. From the fact that such incitement went unpunished, it was easy to see that the press in Germany was really free, and they declared that in fact the German proletariat had thoroughly understood the fundamental principles at stake, so much so that it reproached the United Diet not with having won them, but with having lost them. Had the United Diet not contented itself with demanding merely the extension of its own rights, but instead demanded trial by jury, equality before the law, the abolition of forced labor, the freedom of the press, the right of free association and the convening of a really representative body, then it would have received the wholehearted support of the proletariat. The pious mumblings of the Rheinische Beobachter about the social principles of Christianity which made communism unnecessary were thoroughly disposed of. The social principles of Christianity have had 1800 years in which to develop, and they need no further development at the hands of Prussian ecclesiastical commissioners. The social principles of Christianity justified slavery in the classic world, and they glorified medieval serfdom. And if necessary they are quite willing to defend the oppression of the proletariat even if they should wear a somewhat crestfallen appearance the while. The social principles of Christianity preach the necessity of a ruling and an oppressed class, and all they have to offer to the latter is the pious wish that the former may be charitable. The social principles of Christianity transfer the reparation of all infamies to the realms of heaven, and thus they justify the perpetuation of these infamies on earth. The social principles of Christianity declare that all the villainies of the oppressors against the oppressed are either the just punishment for original or other sin, or tribulations which God in his inscrutable wisdom causes the redeemed to suffer. The social principles of Christianity preach cowardice, self-abasement, resignation, submission and humility, in short, all the characteristics of the canaille. But the proletariat is not prepared to let itself be treated as canaille, and it needs its courage, confidence, pride and independence even more than it needs its daily bread. The social principles of Christianity are sneaking and hypocritical whilst the proletariat is revolutionary. It was this revolutionary proletariat which Marx and Engels led into the field against the blandishments of monarchist social reform. A people prepared to thank its rulers with tears in its eyes for a kick accompanied by a penny existed only in the imagination of a king. The real people, the proletariat, was, in the words of Hobbes, a robust and dangerous youth. And its way of dealing with kings who tried to worst it could be seen graphically in the fate of Charles I of England and Louis XVI of France. This answer broke over the feudal socialist crop like a hailstorm, though some of the stones fell wide of the mark. Marx and Engels were right when they defended the action of the United Diet in refusing to grant monies to a reactionary and negligent government. But they did the Diet too much honor when they adopted the same attitude towards its rejection of a government income tax proposal. The proposal was in fact a trap set for the bourgeoisie by the government. The demand that the milling and slaughtering taxes, which weighed most heavily on the workers in the big towns, should be abolished and the resultant financial deficit made up by means of an income tax on the propertied classes, had first been raised by the Rhenish bourgeoisie, which was moved by considerations similar to those which moved the English bourgeoisie in its struggle for the repeal of the Corn Laws. The government itself was strongly opposed to this proposal because it struck at the rich landowners, who could not, as a result of the abolition of these taxes, expect any fall in the wages of the workers exploited by them, since the taxes were imposed in the big cities only. However, it brought in the necessary bill because it felt sure that a feudal corporative body like the United Diet would never agree to a tax reform which benefited the working classes even temporarily at the expense of the possessing classes, and it hoped therefore to make itself popular and the Diet unpopular. How right the government was in its calculation was seen when the bill came before the Diet and almost all the princes, almost all the junkers and almost all the officials voted against it. In addition, the government had the good fortune that even a section of the bourgeoisie turned tail hurriedly when it came to the point. The rejection of the income tax proposal was then thoroughly exploited by the subsidized press as a striking proof of the hypocritical and deceitful game being played by the bourgeoisie. And the Renishibobok in particular rode the poor nag to death, when Marx and Engels answered their ecclesiastical commissioner by informing him that he was the biggest and most shameless ignoramus in economic matters for asserting that the introduction of an income tax would alter the existing social misery by one hair's breadth. They were quite right. But they were not right when they defended the rejection of the bill by the bourgeoisie as a justifiable blow against the government. The action of the bourgeoisie was in fact not a blow against the government at all, and the rejection of the bill rather strengthened the government's financial position than otherwise, for it retained its efficient milling and slaughtering taxes instead of experimenting with a new income tax, whose imposition would certainly have met with innumerable difficulties, as the history of all such taxes has shown. In this case therefore, Marx and Engels regarded the bourgeoisie as still revolutionary when in fact it was already reactionary. On the other hand, the true socialists made the opposite mistake often enough, and it is understandable that at a time when the bourgeoisie was girding its loins for the fray, Marx and Engels delivered another attack on them. The attack was delivered in a number of belletristic contributions which Marx published in the Deutsche Brüsseler Zeitung, against German socialism in prose and verse, and in an unpublished contribution which is in Engels' handwriting but was probably a joint work. True socialism was attacked this time chiefly from its aesthetic literary aspect, which was its weakest, or, according to taste, its strongest side. In their attack on this literary perversion Marx and Engels did not always sufficiently respect the rights of literature and art. For instance, in the handwritten contribution referred to above, Freiligrot's splendid Caira is treated with unconscionable severity. Karl Beck's Songs of the Poor also harshly treated by Marx in the Deutsche Brüsseler Zeitung on account of their petty bourgeois illusions. But at the same time Marx prophesied the sorry fate of that pretentious naturalism which was to develop 50 years later when he wrote, Beck belauds this cowardly petty bourgeois misery. His hero is the poor man, the pauvre Hunt who, with his pious, petty and inconsequent longings, instead of the proud, menacing and revolutionary proletarian. The unfortunate Grun then came in for a thorough castigation on account of a long-since forgotten book in which he had maltreated Goethe from a human standpoint by painstakingly piecing together a picture of what he alleged was the real man out of all the petty, boring and philistine traits of the great poet. More important than this skirmishing was a longer work in which Marx dealt as severely with the usual radical phraseology of the bourgeoisie as he did with the pseudo-socialist phraseology of the government. In a polemic against Engels, Karl Heinz had sought to explain injustice in the distribution of property as the result of state power, declaring everyone a coward and fool who attacked the bourgeoisie for its accumulation of money whilst leaving the king with his accumulation of power in peace. Heinz himself was a very mediocre phrasemonger and unworthy of any particular attention, but his arguments were very much after the heart of the enlightened Philistine. The monarchy owed its existence to the fact that for centuries humanity had been without common sense and without human dignity. And now that humanity was once again in possession of these valuable attributes, all social problems paled into insignificance before the great question, monarchy or republic. This brilliant argument was a suitable complement to the argument of the princes that revolutions were caused purely by the wickedness of demagogues. Marx demonstrated, chiefly on the basis of German history, that history made the princes, not vice versa. He laid bare the economic causes of the absolute monarchy, pointing out that it developed in a transitional period when the old feudal classes were in decline and the new class of modern bourgeois still in process of formation. The fact that the absolute monarchy had developed later in Germany and was lasting longer was due to the crippled development of the German bourgeoisie. The violently reactionary role being played by the princes was thus due to economic reasons, where the absolute monarchy formally encouraged trade and industry and the simultaneous rise of the bourgeoisie as necessary conditions of national power and of its own magnificence. It now sought to hamper them everywhere as increasingly dangerous weapons in the hands of a bourgeoisie already grown too powerful. The absolute monarchy was now turning its dull and anxious glance away from the town, the origin of its own rise to power, to the countryside, whose fields were manured with the corpses of its old and valiant feudal opponents. This work contains many fruitful ideas, but the common sense of the admirable Philistine was proof against it. The same theory which Marx took up on Engels' behalf against Heinz and had to be taken up again a full generation later by Engels on Marx's behalf against Dühring.